Welcome to This Explainer. You know, when we think of ancient Egypt, our minds instantly go to the glittering gold of the pharaohs and those massive stone monuments, right? Well, today, we're actually going to turn our gaze away from all that. We're going to dig into the mud and silt to uncover a much more profound reality. We're going to immerse ourselves in the grueling, incredibly sensory world of the ancient Egyptian farmer. We're going to reconstruct this entire civilization not from the throne down, but from the ground up, through the calloused, mud-stained hands of the ordinary people who literally kept it all alive.
So, it brings up a massive question. Who truly built the empire of the pharaohs? We always just kind of assume kings build civilizations, don't we? But when you actually dig into the archaeological and demographic evidence, an undeniable truth comes into focus. The glory of the entire Egyptian empire rested squarely on the backs of the peasantry. It was their daily, relentless survival that actually bankrolled the empire.
And their everyday reality was a far cry from carved stone palaces. We're talking about incredibly modest, simple dwellings made from reeds and sun-baked mud brick. They were tethered directly to the earth, living inside structures built from the exact same silt they spent their entire lives cultivating.
To really wrap your head around this, we have to look at the sheer scale of it. For over 3,000 years, more than 80% of the population lived exactly like this. 80%! They were the relentless, unyielding engine of antiquity. I mean, without them, there are no temples, absolutely no scribes, and definitely no pharaohs. But this architecture wasn't just simple. It was actually a brilliant survival mechanism. Those thick mud brick walls provided absolutely crucial insulation from the baking sun. And notice the tiny windows placed way up near the ceiling. Those let the rising heat escape while keeping out the suffocating, blowing dust. And the flat roofs were just as important. Down on the ground, temperatures could easily hit a stifling 40 degrees Celsius. That's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So the roof became a vital refuge, a place to actually sleep under the night sky and escape the trapped heat of the house.
Now, to fuel all that backbreaking physical labor, their diet relied heavily on these incredibly dense loaves of ancient emmer wheat bread. And let me tell you, this was not the soft culinary comfort we're used to today. It was highly textured, grainy, and honestly almost always filled with wind-blown sand that would physically grind down their teeth over the years. But it was packed with the dense carbohydrates they desperately needed just to survive.
You see, the peasant diet wasn't about pleasure. It was strictly about harsh, functional necessity. Along with some Nile fish, onions, garlic, and lentils, they relied heavily on thick, mildly fermented beer. Now, this wasn't for recreation. It functioned almost like a caloric protein shake. Why? Because drinking untreated water straight from the Nile was basically playing Russian roulette with lethal parasites. So this thick, fermented brew was a mandatory, safe hydration alternative for absolutely everyone in the village, and yeah, that includes young children.
And just as their diet was dictated by survival, their entire concept of time was dictated by the Nile. They didn't follow a standard solar calendar like we do. Instead, their existence was rigidly locked into 3 unyielding ecological seasons based completely on the river's behavior: Akhet, Peret, and Shemu. Let's actually walk through a year in their mud-stained footprints.
We start with Akhet, the season of the flood.
During late summer, the river would dramatically swell, rising up to 45 feet, completely swallowing the landscape and putting a hard stop to all agriculture. But as those dangerous floodwaters finally rolled back, they left a gift, a damp, incredibly rich black silt called kemet. This stuff was basically magical. It completely renewed the soil's nutrients naturally, providing the entire economic foundation of ancient Egypt without a single drop of human-made fertilizer.
But if you think the farmers got a well-deserved break while their fields were under 1.5 meters of water, think again. The state ruthlessly exploited this agricultural downtime. Idle farmers were swept up into what's called corvée labor, basically a mandatory state draft. So the very same hands that usually farmed the mud were now forced to quarry stone and drag massive blocks to build the colossal temples and pyramids we still marvel at today.
Next comes Peret, the frantic growing season. As the waters finally receded in November, families were plunged right back into the wet mud to rapidly sow their crops before the moisture vanished. And to keep those crops alive during the increasingly arid months, they relied on sheer physical endurance and a brilliant but utterly exhausting tool called the shaduf. It was a counterweighted lever and bucket system used to manually haul thousands of liters of water from the canals up into the irrigation ditches, all under a baking sun.
Their daily routine was a relentless timeline dictated purely by survival. They were dragged out of bed before dawn,
not because they were naturally early risers, but because of the climate. Attempting heavy field labor through the peak midday summer heat was practically a death sentence. So their entire day, from communal plowing in the morning to resting under whatever sparse shade they could find at noon to eating a simple dinner at dusk, was structured entirely around avoiding the lethal peak of the sun.
Finally, we arrive at Shimu, harvest and taxation.
The arrival of spring brought the harvest, their agricultural payday, but every single stage was intensely punishing. Just imagine the raw blisters from gripping a curved wooden sickle set with jagged flint blades all day long. Then came the gathering and the threshing, where donkeys and oxen trampled the stalks on hard floors to separate the seeds, filling the air with a choking, blinding dust. It was completely exhausting.
And getting through the mud, the sun, and the sheer physical exhaustion of the year, that was honestly only half the battle. Because waiting for them at the end of the harvest were the state scribes. These officials could extract up to 60%, yes, 60% of a family's hard-won yield in taxes. The crushing, inescapable weight of the state was just always looming over them.
So, how did they cope with this overwhelming psychological anxiety? The constant threat of droughts, swarming pests, and those devastating taxes? They turned to their localized faith. They projected their deepest fears onto Reninette, a fierce cobra goddess of the harvest. For them, she wasn't some distant celestial deity up in the sky. They believed she lived right there in the dirt, alongside them, fiercely protecting their grain silos from rodents and decay.
This brings us to part 4, the true cost of civilization. Now, you might be wondering, how did the literate elite, the scribes and bureaucrats, who literally relied on this labor to survive, view the peasantry? Well, texts like the Satire of the Trades tell us exactly what they thought. This text completely mocks the potter for grubbing in the mud like a pig, and dismisses the exhausted farmer as someone who, quote, wails more than the guinea fowl. The quiet dignity of their daily survival was just reduced to a crude joke.
And what's really fascinating and kind of dark is how this ancient propaganda was actually used. It was essentially a textbook, routinely copied in scribal schools to psychologically condition young bureaucrats. It literally taught them to feel inherently superior to the laborers. It reinforced a rigid social hierarchy, where being able to read was seen as a divine right, and physical labor was equated with inherent misery and low status.
Yet despite all the mockery from the elites and the absolutely crushing socioeconomic burdens, the material reality speaks for itself. The peasantry sustained a massive, sprawling economy without an ounce of modern technology. They bore the staggering weight of state taxation and literally built and maintained the infrastructure through their forced labor, all while enduring extreme ecological constraints. It was their unparalleled resilience, pure and simple, that allowed Egypt to endure for millennia. So, I want to leave you with this final thought as we wrap up our explainer today. The next time you picture ancient Egypt, or look at a photo of the Great Pyramids, ask yourself, whose legacy is truly etched into the sands of time? Is it the pharaoh who simply decreed the monument, or is it the millions of unnamed, unsung farmers who dug the canals, sowed the silt, and dragged the very stones? Thank you so much for exploring this historical reality with me.